Hey, you awesome folks! Thanks for taking this journey of discovery with your guide, Keith Haney. You're listening to the Becoming Bridge Builders podcast, your favorite podcast for everything from racial reconciliation to education innovation, justice reform, and leading change in the 21st century. This podcast is for people who love to be challenged with difficult topics, but want practical solutions to solve these challenging issues. Becoming Bridge Builders makes change possible. Each week on the podcast, Keith invites innovative thought leaders to share how they are building bridges in their area of expertise. You will hear breakthrough ideas and concepts that are changing the world. He's featuring guests who are best-selling authors, leaders at Microsoft, entrepreneurs, leading educators, professors, lawyers, and so many more. Listen in to learn how you can be the bridge to the change you are seeking.
My guest today is Tracy Ripley. She is a wife, a devoted mother, and stepmother to 4 children. Tracy is a child of God and attributes her strong faith to the trials she and her family have endured through her youngest son's battle with CHD. Her testimony of faith has helped shed light on the world of CHD, spreading awareness and providing help to other families faced with a different path for their infant child than they might have ever dreamed. Tracy is a passionate advocate for children with CHD. Her life experiences and many other obstacles her son has overcome throughout his own CHD journey have awarded her the insight and knowledge she uses to help educate others and spread awareness about the leading cause of birth defect associated with infant illness and death. We welcome Tracy to the podcast. Well, Tracy, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
So good to have you. I'm looking forward to this important conversation and the insights you will bring to my audience. So this will be a great conversation.
Looking forward to it.
I'm going to ask you my favorite question. What's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Okay. The best piece of advice actually that I received it probably 12 years before I really needed it. So I actually was at a company that I work for. They were kind of doing a business development training and sort of a people skills training. And it was a third party speaker that had come to talk to us. And something he said has stuck with me since it was like 25 years ago. And he said that do not allow people to live rent free in your head or in your mind. And, at the time when he said it, I was like, well, that's sort of an interesting take on things, but really, after my youngest son was born with a congenital heart disease, I really struggled with guilt and anger and resentment towards others. And that's when I really learned what he was talking about and how you give power to others over your thoughts, your feelings, and sometimes even your actions, and maybe even keeping you from moving forward because you cannot let go or release that.
That makes so much sense. I use that a lot in my church too, especially talking about forgiveness. Because I had a congregation at just one church. A lot of people struggle with this idea of letting go of past hurts, and I use that all the time. It's like they're living rent free in your brain. You are focused on them. I say, I guarantee you, most of them have not remembered anything that they did or said to you, and you're just carrying this for no apparent reason, and it's just hurting you versus punishing the person you think you're punishing ultimately.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I love that one. I'm always curious too, who are some people in your life that have served as a mentor or even a inspiration for you on your journey?
Well, I've had a lot of mentors in my life. Of course, my parents, grandparents are probably the very first mentors I ever had. And actually, because of them, that's where my foundation for faith and where that comes from. But as an adult, I would have to say my pastor. So, Pastor Susan, she has been my pastor for 25 years now. She was at my son's bedside through both of his open heart surgeries. She has helped me pray through all of he's had actually 8 total surgeries, 10 procedures in a 12-year, he's only 12 years old. And she has been there through every step of it, helping with my faith journey. And, when sometimes I was struggling or maybe even angry at God, she has been a lifeline there and helped me along the way. I've also had mentors. I spent 27 years in accounting and finance. So I've had some really good managers and bosses. But if I had to pick one from that part of my life, it was actually one of the VPs of finance from the last company I worked for, and I would say he was a mentor, not only in my journey as a finance manager, but his the things I learned from him helped me on this part of this end of my journey as an author, because I learned not only confidence from him and and learning that so I was the only female finance manager on the segment I supported, and so I sat at the table with all men leadership from the leadership team. And he helped me to learn that as a woman, my voice mattered and that I had a different view on things. I had a different take or opinion on things. And sometimes I would sit quietly and not say anything. And he would say, I need you to speak up. I want you have a seat at this table for a reason. And you have a different take. And so I need you to share that. Um, and so that was a very important lesson for me. And um, the other thing I think he taught me was that as a finance person, sometimes you're talking and you're giving results to people that are not financial, they don't have the finance background, or maybe they have a little bit. But he said, you have to make the numbers interest. You need to provide context and the underlying details to help them connect. So you can't just say, oh, yes, sales are up, supplies up, demand's down. Like finance people might get that. But non-finance people are not going to understand. And so that's where he helped me. And I took that knowledge and that learning in my book so that when I built up my characters and I sort of gave the underlying details, that I helped people to understand, how did I get to be the person I am? I didn't just have a child with congenital heart disease and find the Lord, I kind of learned to give that context. So I would say those are two major influences in my life that helped me get to where I'm at today.
That's great, because I think help you learn to tell your story and speak out is so important, because I know a lot of people think I don't have any value. What I have to offer, no one really cares about.
Yeah.
But we all have a voice and we all have a unique way of communicating that. And God orchestrates and designs us in a certain way that we can say something that no one else can say in a way that only we can say it. And those voices are always important. So I'm glad he reminded you of your value. So tell us about your family, about your journey as a wife, mother, and stepmother.
Well, my husband Rob and we married in 1999. So it's almost 26 years now for us. And at the time, he had 2 children. They were younger in age from his first marriage. And so the first 10 years of our marriage, they were the only children that we had. And, that was sort of purposeful at the time. I was still trying to get my degree and I was working at night. I was going to school at night and I was working full time. So it didn't make sense for us to kind of add another child to the mix. And, when I finally got my degree, my husband and I decided, okay, we're going to try to have a child together. And of course, in my mind, I'm like, this is when I want to do things and I want to be this old and I'm going to have this many kids. And, God said, no, that's not the way it's going to work. And so we went through a period of time of infertility, and it was a very hard struggle for me emotionally. It was very draining, and I finally kind of just gave it up, gave it back to the Lord, and said, "Okay, well, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'm not supposed to be a birth mother." And my husband and I kind of switched gears, and we started building a new house together. And he was building it himself. As I said, he's a carpenter. Um, and so we were focusing all of our time and attention on that. And we were not focusing on, trying to have a child together. And then I started not feeling so good. I thought maybe I was tired, stressed out. I had taken on a new role at work and all of the details of the build. And then I found out I was pregnant. And that was, for me, the first time that I really learned that patience is having faith in God's timing and that his timing is always perfect. Um, and so 4.5 years after that, my youngest son was born, and, our family was blessed. So we now have 4 children. There are actually 21 years between our oldest son and the youngest son. So that kind of rounded out our little family, and very blessed to be a mother and a stepmother to all of them. And now a grandmother.
Oh, congratulations. I know
Yes,
that experience.
yes, I
So
love
when
it.
did you first learn about your youngest son's congenital heart disease?
So I actually learned about that. He was 14 hours old. So the whole time I was pregnant, we had no issues. There were no concerns. Um, there was a couple of flags when very early on, when I took one of the initial tests that they give you. But that even came back, we had to do like further testing, and that came back fine. So it wasn't until he was 14 hours old, and it was very happenstance. Like, it was actually in my book, I call it God's grace, because what happened was, it was like very early in the morning. It was probably like 6 or 7 in the morning, and a nurse had come in to take his vitals, and I didn't recognize her, so I thought she was my new nurse, and she said, "Oh no, we're having staffing issues, so I'm just helping out." So she was listening to, checking his breathing, and is listening to his heart. And she says, "Oh, he has a murmur." And I'm kind of shocked, and said, "That's interesting, because you're the first one to say that." And he had been seen by several doctors, several nurses, and no one had said that. And she says, "Oh, yeah, my son had a murmur like that, but he outgrew it." And so that kicked off, because she caught that. She reached out to the cardiologist team, and they came and did an echo, and then they were able to diagnose him with aortic stenosis. But it was a nurse who walked in my room, who was not supposed to be there, but came in because of staffing issues, and heard the murmur.
It's amazing how God does that, isn't it? How this wasn't supposed to be on this floor, wasn't supposed to be working there. And
Yeah.
that person, I saw something that, no one else may have caught.
Yes.
As you think about, what you had to go through with that, how did your faith guide you? Because I'm sure that just threw your whole life in a tizzy.
It did. It's funny because, like, February was American Heart Month, and as a kid, I always participated in the Heart Challenge, or I think when I was a kid, it was the Jump for Heart Challenge, and they raised money at the schools. That was my extent of knowledge about, congenital heart disease or heart issues. And I always attributed it to, you needed to eat healthy, you needed to exercise. So I never really thought or knew anything about children who were born with a congenital condition. And so that day, it threw me into a world of complete unknown. And it was overwhelming, to say the least. And I did do a lot of research and read a lot of statistics and things, which didn't help at the time, because the statistics are always scary. And not very many children at the time were living to adulthood. So I wondered what my son's life was going to look like. Was I going to see him grow up? Would I ever know what his laugh sounds like? I'm not going to cry. What his personality was going to be like. And it was very hard in the beginning. And I talk a little bit about this, or I guess I talk a lot about it in my book. My son ended up actually in he was in heart failure, and he went into heart failure at 4 weeks old. However, he was not, let's just back up a little bit. So he went into heart failure, and we didn't know it was. I was able to bring him home, so he was home with me, but I had noticed some strange breathing that I'm like, I don't think he's done that before. And I was home with him all day. My husband was back to work. So I'm like, have you seen him do this? And he's like, yeah, I think I've seen him do that. Well, I went to the pediatrician, had the pediatrician look at him. The pediatrician sent me back home, said it was, normal. Babies sometimes have an irregular rhythm, is kind of what he called it. And, we went back to life as normal. A week later, he started throwing up every time I fed him. And, it was like really strange because it came on very fast. And so I called the pediatrician again and I said, I think I should bring him in. And maybe he's got some kind of stomach flu. And because I have a 4-year-old, my daughter was 4 at the time. We thought maybe she brought something home from preschool. So we go in to have him looked at, and the pediatrician tells us he has acid reflux. And, it was strange because I said, well, usually, and he even said, babies don't usually, if they have acid reflux, they have it from the beginning, so it was like weird that he had it all of a sudden. But I had a cardiologist appointment scheduled the next day. So he said, make sure you go to your appointment. I go the next day to my appointment. And after they did the echo, my cardiologist says, we need to admit him. And at this same week, 3 days prior, my father-in-law had passed away. And so my husband wasn't with me at this appointment because he was with my pastor planning the funeral. And so I start arguing with the cardiologist and saying, wait, no, you said that we were going to schedule this. I don't have time for this right now. We have a funeral tomorrow, or what was in 2 days. And he looked at me and he said, you and your husband go do what you need to do. He will be here in good hands, but he needs medicine now. And I could tell him, like, he has never spoke to me this way. He was always soft spoken. And I'm like, now I know it's serious. And I looked him straight in the face and said, is he going to die? And my cardiologist said, he is very sick and he needs medicine now. So they let me carry him over to the PICU, and they admitted him. And they told me that they needed to start this PIC line. They were going to put it in his leg, but they said, we only have one try. If they can't set it, then they won't try in the other leg because they need the other leg for the balloon cath, which is the surgery they were going to do. And so they go through this whole thing of all the risks and worries, and what choice do I have? I have no choice. Like, what's the alternative? Right. So by this time now, my husband has shown up, and we both kind of go out of the room because I didn't want to make her nervous. I said, you do what you need to do. And we went out in the hallway and I prayed. Right. And we come back and she said, okay, the medicine's in. She got it started, and they started this epinephrine drip, which was supposed to kind of regulate his heartbeat, because his heart rate, which they didn't tell me this at the time, I learned later, he had 12% heart function.
Wow.
12%. So they needed to get his heart stable to even be able to go into surgery. So that night then, my husband stayed as long as he could, but he was busy. Like I said, he was still grieving. He needed to still write the eulogy. My 4-year-old daughter was at home, and, she had just lost her grandfather and didn't understand what was going on. She's like, last time Grandpa went to the hospital, you didn't come home. Now, Bryson, you were at the hospital. Are you guys not going to come home? So he went home to be with our daughter. And so I stayed at the hospital alone. Because he needed surgery, they weren't allowing me to feed him. Well, I was nursing. And so my son like could sense me, and he'd like start rooting. I don't know if you've heard when babies root and they turn their heads, and he's crying because he's like mad, like the food's right there. Why don't you just feed me? And and I couldn't. They wouldn't let me. So they put like blankets and pillows between us to sort of offset that. And you know, eventually my son just stopped crying. He wasn't trying to eat anymore. He just lay there in my arms, real quiet, not really even making noise. And I wouldn't put him back in the bed. I just kept holding him. And so the nurse, now it's like 3 a.m. The nurse goes out. She's doing her charting or whatever she needed to do. And I'm sitting alone in the dark, praying over my child. And you know, I could have felt alone. I could have felt despair and like, why is this happening to me? Why me, Lord? Why, please save my son. Instead, I did not let fear come into that room. I prayed to God and I thanked him. I thanked him for that nurse that found the murmur. I thanked him for the nurse that set the PIC line, for the cardiologist who diagnosed him, who saw me that day and wouldn't let this mom who was arguing that, no, not today, I don't have time for this. And he wouldn't take that. And he said, no, you go about your business. We're going to take care of your son. And I thanked him for the cardiologist. And I thanked him that I had a job and access to health care so close to home. And I think that night was a pivotal moment for me with my faith. That's really where my faith kind of just bloomed. And I started just trusting in the Lord. And when fear crept in, I would just pray and try to come at it with a heart of gratitude and thanking him for the blessings that he had given us.
Oh, that's amazing story account, because it's like you could have gone into the deep place, dark place of why me, Lord? This isn't fair. But to turn that into, God, you've been here with me this whole time, even though I didn't see it. You sent people into my life at just the right moment that have given me good advice, and you are taking care of me. So I appreciate that. Which I want to kind of dig into. I think this kind of led to your book, if I'm not mistaken, The Prayerful Warrior Mom. Tell us about what inspired you to write this book.
Okay, so that was a very strange story. And I know when I say it, people are, they may believe me and they may not. Um, but my son was 10 years old. He had already went through, he had the balloon cath, the one that he had already had a open heart surgery at 4 years old. And during this whole time, I was moving up the career ladder in my finance career, and each move meant more responsibility, more time away from my family. And as you can imagine, with caring for a child who has a chronic condition, it really put me at, I constantly felt like I was at a tug of war of, wanting to progress in my career and do well for the, people I worked for and my team at work, but also wanting to be, the mom my children needed, the wife that my husband needed. And so I kept praying and telling God, I just feel like this can't be my purpose in life, to be tied to this laptop. And I kept asking him, please, Father, show me how to share your light and your love with the world. I kept praying that for years. I kept praying it. Well, then things changed drastically at my work. We went through 4 CEOs in about a 15-month period, and it was very intense. There was a lot of demands for reports and things, especially from the finance team. Sometimes we would need them, like, we need this by 3 o'clock, and it doesn't matter what other priorities you have. This is first. And then when you would say, oh, so is the other things that I had due today, does that need to be tomorrow? Oh, no, you still need to do those today, but this one comes first. And it was you know, every day like that. It was constant. So we were constantly under this stress. And I just kept feeling like I can't do this to my family. My son was, young, and my daughter, they're still in school. And so one night, it was about 3 in the morning, and I awoke to it. It felt like a dream. It felt like a thought. It was very strange. Like, did I think that? Did someone say that? Like, you know, and it said, use your 401k. And I was like, this is strange. Like, what? And I kind of pushed it aside and didn't really think about it again for about a month. And then I started getting inundated with flyers and things by by my employer about learning about our pension and going to these classes about our pension and being educated. Well, I ended up signing up for this pension class, and wouldn't you know, the very first example, the very first slide, they're talking about a woman who is 50 years old who takes a early retirement. And, it obviously says there's tax implications. So I'm not going to get into that here. But I thought it was very strange because I'm like, everything I had been told up until that moment, that I was not able to touch my pension until I was 55. And I'm like, so why is this? I'm like, that has to be a typo. 50. I was 49 and about to turn 50. So, I'll fast forward a bit. I had some meetings with my financial advisor, talked through it, learned a lot about the whole rule of 55. Anyways, I ended up telling my employer that I was going to take this early retirement. And 2 weeks later, I found out my son was going to have another surgery, which at the time we thought, okay, well, we were told if he had to have another surgery, it would be through his leg, not open heart. Well, I found out, no, it was going to be another open heart surgery. So then I thought, okay, this just confirmed that I needed to do this. I needed to step away from this stressful job so I could be with my son through this. And after my son had the surgery, um, a few months later, and he was back to school, I'm now thinking, well, okay, what am I going to do now? What is my life going to look like? I don't necessarily want to go back to what I was doing. I certainly don't want that stressful job. And then again, at 3 in the morning, I awoke to a dream or a thought that said, you should write a book. And I was like, what? Who's going to want to read my story? Like, who? There I go again, questioning my worth. But that thought wouldn't leave me. Like, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so then I started researching, how do I self-publish? And so that really was what pushed me to share our story and to actually get it out there and publish my own book.
Wow, what a powerful story. So tell us how you have become an advocate, because I know going through this, you start to understand and have an insight that some people don't. So for the parents who are going through a similar situation, what words of wisdom do you have for them?
Well, how I got started as an advocate, I would say first of all was when my son was born. In fact, I wasn't really even on social media. I didn't even do Facebook until my son was born, and mostly it was because um, I had so many people would come up to me when they found out, my son had a heart issue, and they would ask me, um, "Oh, well, he had surgery. Then so great that he's cured." And then I'd have to explain, well, it's his whole life. Like, he's probably going to have multiple surgeries, and it's not a one and done thing. Or some people would kind of, if as he got older and after he had his first surgery, sometimes he would be playing and he would be dripping in sweat and his face is red. And we would say, you need to come over here and sit down and get a drink. And then I would get this unsolicited advice that would tell me, oh, just let kids be kids. They're just being kids, like I was being a helicopter mom. And it was somebody who didn't really know our story. And I remember getting angry and like, well, who are you to tell me, and and then I realized that, well, they don't understand. They unless you have lived it or walked in our shoes, you just don't understand. And so that's when I really started advocating. And that's really what I tried to do with my book, to help people understand and also to help a new mom. So I tried to think about, if I was me when, 12 years ago, when we were first starting out, knowing nothing, what would I say to that? What would I say to myself? And so that's what I tried to convey in my book, to help them understand and also to give them tools, because that way they don't have to learn the hard way as I did, to set healthy boundaries. And that can be at work and at home, because sometimes, when you have a child that has a chronic issue and you have to tell somebody, you can't come in here if you're sick. And now, granted, this was before the whole COVID thing, so sometimes when I would tell people, no, I can't take him out in public because we can't risk him getting sick. And they would be like, what do you mean you can't take him out in public? So helping new parents understand how to cope with that, how to understand that, people aren't really trying to be malicious. They're not being insensitive. They just don't understand, and helping them to prepare their mind so that when they hear those kind of comments, instead of maybe giving a snarky comment like, who are you to tell me my kid can't do that? But to say, well, he's had heart surgery, and so he's not allowed, because they don't know. And I often call CHD the invisible disease, because it, unless you can see their scar, which sometimes, depending on the shirt, you can see my son's scars. But other than that, you wouldn't know it to look at them. And so it's easy for people to make assumptions, and for parents to feel hurt, because it's not that people are being uncaring or that, but I did try to share that in my book. And as I mentioned about that setting healthy boundaries, I had to also learn to focus on things that I could control, and not like everything else that was out of my control. That's in God's hands. I gave that to God and let Him run that. And I had to learn that lesson the hard way. Sometimes it took me multiple times to learn. And, um, but those are the lessons that I try to help others. And I'll leave the last thing, which I think is probably the most important, that I learned and that I hope to convey. I have a whole chapter in my book dedicated to learning about forgiveness and learning to let go of that anger and that resentment, to give that to God, because that for me was such a healing journey and a process. And it is not overnight. It is a journey, and sometimes there are good days and sometimes there are bad days, right? But learning to forgive not only myself, because I blame myself for not pushing hard enough for the pediatrician. I blame myself for not calling the cardiologist myself and saying, hey, did you know that we were because the pediatrician had not told the cardiologist. I had a lot of anger and guilt towards the pediatrician, and I had to let all of that go. And when I did, it was almost like I was a different person. I felt like I could finally love my children the way I wanted to. I wasn't snapping at my husband and then realizing like, oh, that sounded worse than I intended it to. And not really realizing why I was doing that. But it was because out of the heart, or out of the mouth, the heart speaks, right? That's what scripture tells us. And I had to learn that all of that anger and resentment was what I was giving back to the people I loved. And I didn't want to do that. So learning to forgive and let go helped me to be a better mother, be a better sister or daughter, and parent. and wife.
So how is your book being received?
Well, it's doing quite well. It's been a year now that it's been out in the market. I've sold about 420 books, and I'm getting a lot of great feedback. And I think one of the big things that really gives me some joy, or that were surprising to me, are the moms that reach out to me, that message me. Maybe they're not friends with me on Facebook, but they find me, or they saw my book in one of the Heart Mom groups, and they reach out and tell me the stories about how my book has helped them. Um, if I may share just a little story of
Sure.
this one lady, when I first published my book, brought me to tears, because she said that she kept seeing, I think it was an ad for my book. She said, every time I get on Facebook, I saw your book. And she said, I would swipe it away, because she said, I was too angry at God to pray. And she said, I kept feeling prayers are not going to fix my son. And she said, every time she would get on there, it would be on there again, and she would swipe it away. And then one day she said, I decided to read your book for the heart aspects, but not for the faith aspects. And then she told me that as she read my book, there were so many similarities. Her husband was in finance. She had a 4-year-old daughter at the time, or I don't think she told me the sex. So 4-year-old child at the same time that her child was born, was also diagnosed with severe aortic stenosis. She said that she wished she would have started writing down all of the similarities, because there were so many. And she said that she felt like she was reading her own child's journey and their story, but getting a glimpse of their future. And she said it was the first time since he was born that she was able to be at peace and not wake up in the morning angry at God, and that was finally able to, open her Bible and pray again. And I just thought that was wonderful. Even if, she was the only other person to tell me that, at least I knew my book touched and changed one person's heart, and maybe had them turn back to God.
What an inspiring story. It makes you feel good to know that God used you to touch her heart.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'd love to ask my guest this other question. What do you want your legacy to be?
Oh, that's a tough one, right? My legacy. Well, I mentioned how, I prayed to God and asked him to use me to help me spread his light and love in the world. And I hope that when I'm no longer here, that my story will continue to be shared, and will help lead others to either want to know the God that I serve, or to bring them back. Maybe they've strayed away, or maybe some church hurt led them to leave, but that something I shared, or something they read in my book, turned their face back to God, so that they could know the love and the grace that have blessed my life. And I hope that that continues when I'm not here.
That's beautiful. I'd love to ask you, as we kind of wrap up this great conversation, what key takeaways do you want the listeners to gain from our conversation?
Um, well, I hope that, one, that they want to learn about God and Jesus, and to dig deeper into that, to open their Bible. I hope that they will see that, when you have something in your life, a challenge, or for me it was both work and my son's chronic illness, that you're not alone. And that, like, I'm going to use an example from me. The beauty of writing your book is when you turn around and look at your life, and you're trying to, like, see it from a different lens, because you get the beauty of hindsight, right? And I look back and I think all of the moments in my life where I felt alone, where felt it was the most darkest, the most times of where I could have just said, I can't put another foot forward. All of those moments were moments when I had let things of this world distract me. And I was so busy just doing, so busy working, so busy, worrying about my son and what his future was looking like. And I was not walking with God. I was not reading my Bible. I was not going to church because I was too busy, or I was not, listening to my worship music, or I was not praying and talking to him every day. Those are the moments when I felt the most despair. And so when you are in those moments, instead of feeling alone and feeling like you don't have anyone to walk this with you, I hope that from this conversation that they will learn that they're not alone. And if they just take God's hand, he is waiting, he is extending it, but you have to invite him in.
I love that. That's a beautiful message. Where can listeners find your book, The Prayerful Warrior Mom, and connect with you on social media?
So it is available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I do sell it directly from my website, which is prayerfulwarrior.com. And if you go to my website, you'll see all of my social media handles are available there. I'm on Pinterest, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Or I guess it's called X now. Yeah.
Some of us still call it Twitter.
Yeah.
So I'm sure everybody's going to want me to ask this question. I'm sure they're all kind of dying to know, how is your son doing today?
Oh, he's doing amazing. Very resilient. He has such a positive attitude. And for the first time ever, he got to play basketball. Now, we did have to adjust a bit because, that obviously that's a sport with lots of running. But we were very fortunate and blessed to have coaches that worked with him, that knew and paid attention. If he needed to get a break, they would pull him out and sit him. And that was such a blessing because, when my son had his balloon calf at 5 weeks old, we were told then that he would never play coach sports. And for him to play basketball this year was just, I didn't even care if he ever made a basket. I was just rooting for him because he was on that court and he was able to play.
Wow, that's neat. Thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing your story and encouraging us and to remember that, even when things look bleak, know that God's always there. He's never abandoned us, never forsaken us. He's always there. And just that moment of you looking at the ways God is blessing you in that moment kind of makes us remind ourselves that in those times, look for what God is doing, not what you think God hasn't done, as a reminder. So thank you for that reminder.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate that. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Well, God bless your journey and the work in your son, and maybe he be the next Michael Jordan.
I don't know about that. Yeah, but I'm glad he's on the court. Right.
Yeah, God is good.
Yes, he is.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you.
Do you know that most entrepreneurs hit a revenue ceiling and have no idea why? They're working harder, spending more money, running more ads, but revenue stays flat. My friend Dr. Noah St. John calls this the invisible break. He's giving our listeners a free revenue ceiling audit to help you see what's really holding you back. You'll get a free 30-day membership to Noah Bot, giving you access to Dr. Noah's 30 years of experience to help you reach your next level. But hurry, because there's only 50 available this month. So if you're tired of being stuck at the same revenue level and want to finally break through, get your free revenue ceiling audit at drnoahvault.com in the affiliate link that'll be listed in the show notes.